So a lot of fertilizer producers for nitrogen have already stopped operating in Europe because they can't afford the gas anymore. And then 40% of the world's potash comes from either Belarus or Russia, and that has now been stopped.
Right.
So we're looking
Wow.
at a chronic shortage globally of all three. And we know that means that a lot of poorer farmers around the world are not going to use fertilizer or not going to use enough. And for everyone else, it's going to just be the single largest line item for them. So they're not going to be able to afford to do anything else. So we are looking at the beginning of a multi-year food shortage, multi-continental in scope this year. And of course, Ukraine is going from the world's fifth largest exporter to a net importer, and it will not come back for at least a decade.
Wow. Wow. That's incredible. 10 years, but it totally makes sense. I mean, we'd have to start rebuilding tomorrow if we're going to get there, maybe even with it.
You're right. Canada is where we get most of our potash. We produce most of the nitrogen ourselves. And the phosphates that we don't source within North America either come from Morocco or Israel, and those supplies are safe. But remember, there is no tool to cut off American food exports. So food, at least for now, is still in a semi-globalized environment. And in that environment, you're going to feel the pain. But it's not like we're going to be dealing with food lines or food shortages here in the way that sub-Saharan Africa or maybe South Asia, maybe parts of China, and definitely the Middle East. Yeah, as soon as Mykolaiv falls, and I don't know when that's going to happen, the Ukrainians have really been holding on to a degree that I would have never guessed was possible. But Mykolaiv is kind of the last stop on the road to Odessa. Odessa is the world's largest wheat offloading facility. Watch the bridge. There's one bridge through Mykolaiv, and it's the only bridge between it and the sea, and then you have to go like another 100 miles north to get to the next one. If the Ukrainians blow up that bridge, everything has a little bit more time, but that's about the only bit of good news, if that's the right phrase. We're talking about food price increases that are significantly higher. We only had a tripling of food prices in the Middle East the last time we had any sort of disruption. This is going to be at least twice as bad.
Really? Oh my gosh. So
yeah, I mean, Russia's primary export market is the Middle East. Ukraine's secondary market is the Middle East. That's just not happening this year, and that's independent of the fertilizer program. Yeah,
really
that's a big part of my life right now, is just figuring out how long it's going to take to get replacement systems up online. And I'm not done, but spoiler alert, you're talking a minimum of 5 years. You break down globalization. What this whole talk is just a very small part of it. You break that down, and we've exceeded the pre-industrial carrying capacity of the planet. It's only with fertilizers that we're able to keep 8 billion people alive. And so if you remove the industrial level inputs that allow that to happen, we will have famine. It will be worst in the Middle East, probably second worst in China, because that system hasn't fully broken down yet. And then it's a toss-up for number 3 between sub-Saharan Africa and India, Pakistan. And the only reason that India and Pakistan, I think, are going to come out of this okay is we're the first stop out of the Persian Gulf, so oil, natural gas, they're okay-ish. And they have, on multiple occasions, shown that if they just throw a bottomless supply of people at their agricultural sector, they can get sufficient production by substituting labor for fertilizer. Now, that has other economic problems, but it does mean that mass famine can be avoided to a degree. Well, I mean, India, some of the decisions that the Indians have made over the last 50 years that we look at as just economically silly, like every time the farmers throw a fit, they back away from whatever the modernization program was. And that has always been dumb in a globalized world. In a non-globalized world, that's actually pretty smart. I like to say that India has looked more or less like it has today since the time of the 5th century AD in the Hindu kingdoms. And nothing as small as the end of the world is going to change how India functions. This is just India. In the West, what we think of as the geography of agriculture is changing radically, because they're shutting down nitrogen fertilizer fabrication in Europe because they can't get the natural gas at a price point that makes sense. And then, of course, phosphate is from the east, and potash is from the other side of a new iron curtain. So you're looking at the European continent and all of the former European colonies having to radically overhaul how they even decide agriculture functions and how energy functions. And we're only in the very, very beginning of that unwinding. Yeah,
Oil
no doubt.
prices.
Biden is a populist. Trump was a populist. Obama was a populist. You see a trend here.
Yeah.
And so, if you have an American president who thinks he can ban the export of crude oil in order to protect American consumers from high oil prices, they'll absolutely do it. So, we can have a floor on prices here of about 70 and a ceiling, I'm sorry, a ceiling here of about 70, and a floor everywhere else is at least 150, probably closer to 200. And
Anything
and then we will find
at that
out
level.
just how engaged Americans want to be. Because if we can show to ourselves that we can drop oil prices at the price of everyone else, we're an insulated economy. We're the military position of last resort and first resort for most countries. That puts the United States in a fundamentally different position than we were during the Cold War, where we had to carry the burden in order to fight the Soviets. If we decide to remain involved, knowing that there's a high economic cost and very low payout chances, just doing it because it's the right thing. That's a different America, and that is the America, to be perfectly blunt, we haven't seen for the last 15 years. I would love for that to happen. I do not have high hopes. 3 days after 25 years of whittling it down.
Hmm.
So it's entirely possible that we could have this just complete change of attitude on Europe to all things, but it would take that. And we're going to have a situation in the not too distant future where the Russians are going to try to lever key NATO countries out of the coalition in order to prosecute the Ukraine war. We have to see what they do before anything else.
They're going to try and what? Letter key?
Uh, sorry, think of it as a crowbar. There's a couple of
Okay.
pipelines that go directly to Turkey and Germany that won't be interrupted by sanctions, won't be interrupted by the war or sabotage. And the Russians will give the Europeans, excuse me, the Germans and the Turks the option of keeping the lights on in exchange for some security favors.
Wow. Wow. What an entirely massive, disgusting mess this is. Um, what about all these people talking about how the US dollar, might not be the reserve currency anymore because China and Russia and maybe India are starting to consider settling oil in different currencies. They're
Sure.
going to build their own block. What do we think of this?
Okay, so I never treated that with much sincerity, and the Russians are asking the Indians to pay for the oil in rubles, and nobody wants rubles. Not even the Chinese, who technically have a currency swap agreement with, want rubles. What you want for a global currency is a country that has a deep financial pool, that doesn't care about the day-to-day motion of the currency, uh, and honestly doesn't trade very much, because then they'll have a vested interest. So any country that doesn't match those three is going to manipulate their currency to their own best interests when it comes to trade. So the idea that there's a power out there that is actively involved in the energy markets that can suddenly become this impartial arbiter is silly, because there's nobody. The United States is kind of the perfect match because its energy needs are met within North America or within the United States proper for most things. So I really don't take it seriously at all.